Chapter 26. The Malicious Three. The three men outside Juku's home were drinking beer and playing music from a cheap-looking transistor radio. Jubilant and in high spirits, the men were in celebration mode, and for good reason. They had just been rewarded a huge sum of cash from the son of an ex-governor whose reign had kept them busy for the better part of 4 years. The cash amounted to 100,000 naira apiece, all in British pound sterling. Dressed in identical-looking black t-shirts and denim jeans, the men had been acquainted for 10 years, yet were as different from one another as the proverbial chalk was from cheese. The first two men stood well over 6 feet. One embodied the physique of an anabolic steroid-driven bodybuilder, and the other that of a Japanese sumo wrestler. The third of the trio possessed neither of the dominant traits of his two partners, and at 5'2" was vertically challenged. Growing up in the poverty-riddled slums of Lagos City's Ajegunle town, the three men had discovered that despite their superficial differences, the one thing they all shared was an equal thirst and propensity for mind-numbing violence. A commonality which had drawn them to a life that had begun with petty crime, graduated to armed robbery, and now, 20 years later, the men were frequently hired as enforcers for a number of ambitious politicians and unscrupulous government officials. The muscle man of the bunch went by the nickname Simba. With the body of Schwarzenegger in his prime, he had a prominent tattoo across the base of his throat which spelt out the words, "God First." The sumo wrestler-sized character of the outfit was nicknamed Swallow. Morbidly obese, he was significantly more powerful than his comrades, though, as was evident from his size, he had never come across a meal he saw fit to decline. The midget of the bunch was dancing to the music with a half-empty liquor bottle in his hand. He was known as the Hammer. With the benign facial features of a circus clown, he projected a Ronald McDonald-type charm, incongruously paired with a simmering urge for a unique brand of brutality which exceeded that of his two partners. His methods were quick, sudden, and unpredictable. A knife plunged into an unsuspecting person's side, or the jagged edge of a broken bottle rammed into an individual's eye socket. Three malicious men who longed for a return to a life of crime and brutality which had not only become as addictive as money, sex, or heroin, but a narcotic of which they had been starved of since the ex-governor's unexpected arrest and imprisonment. Now all that remained were memories of a period where they would break a reckless reporter's jaw for asking the wrong question, or terrorize and maim the family of a rival politician who was considered too great a threat to an upcoming campaign. Those days were gone and would likely never return. However, out of loyalty to the ex-governor, the men had pledged their allegiance to his son, Simon, a man who had wisely opted to move with some degree of caution until now. In the last couple of weeks, they had noticed their situation evolving in real time, a chain of events that evoked a feeling similar to the rancid smell of blood in the air, a feeling which sent their pulses racing for the potential return to the cold-hearted excitement of the good old days. They had first become aware of the situation on the day Juku and Eminike had arrived at the bungalow with another girl he had picked up. The woman looked frightened, but this was nothing unusual, as Juku often preferred it that way. Nevertheless, none of them had witnessed the young woman leave, and after spotting Eminike armed with a shovel the following morning, they were now convinced she was lying in a shallow grave somewhere behind the property. Then came the police officer who had arrived with a worried-looking man 2 days earlier, a man who, like the woman before him, had not emerged from the bungalow since the officer's departure. Finally, the visit from a strange-looking individual who had just left, a man in his late 60s dressed from head to toe in white with a large white hat to match. Possessing a neck as narrow as a twig and an abnormally swollen face, the man had the physical appearance of someone terminally ill. Arriving in a rare Mercedes-Benz driven by a white man in uniform, it was evident that not only did this man have serious money to spare, but he was probably the one responsible for the cash they had each received. Money they suspected Juku had given to buy their silence, but silence about what? The girl who they now suspected was dead, or the man who had turned up the previous day and hadn't been seen since? None of the men were sure, but whatever it was, something was brewing. Simba, who was seated at the table, clocked something in the distance. Reaching across to the transistor radio, he snapped off the music. The hammer spun around to face him. "Why now?" he screamed in protest. "Who is this idiot?" Simba mumbled and rose to his feet. Both Swallow, also seated at the table, and the hammer turned to look at who he was referring to. The 6'5", 250-pound force of nature was strolling towards the gates. Chapter 27. Jonah. 3. The hard way. As I approached Juku's residence, I noticed that the men on the front porch were seated at a battered-looking wooden table, swigging large bottles of beer. Looking happy as Larry, one of them was dancing to Afrobeat music echoing from a transistor radio that looked like something straight out of the 1970s. The radio sat on the table alongside a bunch of empty beer bottles and 3 separately placed, crisp-looking bundles of banknotes, which I figured had more than a little something to do with the excitement on display. The men themselves were dressed in black t-shirts and black denim jeans. Aside from this uniformity, they had the appearance of an incongruously matched gang of low-rent thugs. The man dancing was barely over 5 feet, with the beginnings of a beer gut, while his partners were probably of a similar height to myself. One of them was fat as hell, while the other had the muscular build of a man who has spent way too much time developing his body and precious little his brain. The gym nut of the bunch glanced up and spotted me. A bewildered look registered on his face. Mumbling something under his breath, he shut off the music to a loud verbal objection from the midget. Ignoring the dwarf, he rose to his feet, causing his meat-headed buddies to turn and look in my direction. Within seconds, all 3 men were headed towards me. The big guys moved out in front while the midget disappeared behind them. As the welcome committee approached, the sound of a bottle breaking echoed from behind them. A short distance from the gates, I stopped and waited. Waited in silence as all 3 men emerged in turn from a side entrance, strolled over to where I was standing, and parked themselves before me. The little man was closest in proximity, maybe a couple of feet to my right. The musclehead stood directly across from me at a distance of about 4 feet, and right behind him, off to his left, stood the Michelin Man. Their positions appeared random, but were obviously a strategic attack formation of sorts, like something they had done before, which had garnered positive results and inspired a repeat of the same formula. Glancing at the little man to my right, who had both hands in his pockets and a sickening smirk on his face, the first part of their strategy was as crystal as a summer's afternoon. Here was the guy I wasn't supposed to pay much attention to, the midget of the bunch, who, like Joe Pesci in the movie Goodfellas, appeared to be a minor threat, but was typically the most dangerous. A man whose sole intention was to get close enough to launch a vicious and often crippling attack. Spotting a bulge in the man's right pocket and remembering the sound of breaking glass upon the gang's approach. It didn't take much to determine what he was concealing. Reverting my attention to the two men across from me, I happily stored the dwarf in my peripheral vision, good and ready for what he had coming. "Simon Juku in there?" I asked the two big men, motioning to the bungalow with a forward jerk of my chin. The big men exchanged a humorous glance. Then the musclehead turned to me and in a contemptuous tone said, "Simon who?" Then it was the Michelin man's turn. He spoke in broken English. "You know they fear." Like a well-rehearsed double act, the musclehead delivered the next line, which was also in broken English. "I be the craze they worry you." Followed once again by the Michelin man. "You they call my organ name, like saying be a mate." And now the musclehead. This time he slammed the flat of his palm across his chest, like an enraged military dictator. "In my presence." I looked at both men with as much regard as one would have for a pair of clowns reenacting a Laurel and Hardy slapstick routine. I didn't understand every word of what had been said, but the general gist of what was being communicated was pretty obvious. I looked at my watch. Time-wise, I was still in the black, but I wasn't about to be held up. I stared at both men. "I have a proposition for you all," I said. The Michelin man was visibly enraged. "You they mad?" I ignored him. "We can do this the hard way or the easy way. I'll leave it to the three of you to decide. But make no mistake, one way or another, in the next couple of minutes, I'm walking through those gates." The musclehead and the fat man looked at one another. Once again, shaking their heads and chuckling to themselves in disbelief, they bunched up their fists and cracked their knuckles as though to say, "Let's get it on." Turning back to me, the gymnut said, "You get sharp mouth, but by the time we finish with you, all this here America grammar go stop." It was a line I found somewhat hilarious, but a significant part of my attention was still focused on the midget to my right, whose smile had disappeared. Whipping the jagged edge of a broken bottle from the pocket of his jeans, he leapt at me. However, having suffered the physical scar of a bottle attack 2 months earlier, there wasn't a snowball's chance of it happening again. Least of all, from a man who, next to me, looked like an elf. Springing to one side with panther-like reflexes, I smashed a tremendous right hook into the midget's temple, taking him down like a bullet from a sniper. Unconscious before he hit the ground, I flew across his flailing body and delivered a straight punch to the throat of the steroid nut, who appeared startled at the speed at which events were unfolding before him. Doubling over, the musclehead clutched his throat with both hands, like Kennedy in Dallas. But there was more to come. Springing off the ball of my right foot, I vaulted into the air and in the style of a prime Anderson Silva, drove the point of my left knee into his chin and shattered his jawbone like a fragile piece of porcelain. It sent him crashing to the ground, eyes rolling up into the back of his head. Like an unstoppable freight train, I danced over to the fat man. Frozen like a deer in the proverbial headlights, I snapped back his head with a vicious uppercut. Stumbling backward on elephant-sized legs, I was surprised how well he weathered the punch. With blood streaming from the inside of his mouth, he forced a smile. But I'd been in this game too long to be conned. He was hurt, and we both knew it. Throwing up both fists and leading with his right foot in a southpaw stance, the fat man began circling ponderously to his left. "I will deal with you," he gasped, his breathing already labored. Judging from his size and movement, it was clear he was out of shape, but with a rock-solid chin, it was also evident he could take a punch, meaning I was going to need more than one to get the job done. I did nothing for a moment, just waited. Waited for the right time and ideal combination to put him to sleep. Then the moment arrived. Letting out a yell, he rushed at me, arms outstretched, hands reaching desperately to rip away at my limbs. "I will kill you!" Hopping off to one side, I brought his advance to a devastating halt with a crippling right hook to his chin, sending his head ricocheting to his left. I jumped back in front of him and smashed a left hook into the other side of his jaw, sending his head swiveling once more, this time back in the opposite direction, a ruthless combination which did the job, or a significant part of it. Crashing to one knee and gasping like a man on the verge of a coronary, the fat man's head flopped forward, still conscious, still upright, rock-solid chin confirmed. "You stay inside," he gasped, not looking up, but pointing desperately in the direction of the bungalow. I turned to leave, and glancing over at his pals on the ground who were still out, somewhere in Kansas. I thought it was only fair that the fat man got to join them. Whipping back around, I shut out his lights with another silver-inspired knee to the forehead. Chapter 28. Jonah. The rumble in the jungle. Strolling into Juku's compound through the side entrance for the security gates, I marched up to the front door made of polished brass. Twisting open its handle, I let myself in and walked into a large but bland-looking living room. A man who I assumed was Juku was seated on a leather couch. Lounging before an expensive-looking glass table, he was watching a classic scene from Pacino's Scarface on a wall-mounted giant flat screen. Barefoot and dressed in a white vest and blue jeans, Juku, in the tradition of the movie's character Tony Montana, had sitting on the table a heap of cocaine alongside a mounted stack of 50-pound notes and a credit card topped with a white powdered residue. High as the proverbial kite, he gazed up at me, his face splitting into a stupid smile. Maybe it was the coke, maybe he was trying to mask the fact he was on the verge of a coronary. Or maybe, just maybe, he was simply pleased to see me. "Where's Michael?" I said. Staring at me in silence, his ridiculous smile broadened. Like an audience member at a Dave Chappelle gig, he erupted into a fit of laughter. I stared back at him. Then I fired home a message that was as succinct as my question. Turning around, I closed the front door and twisted the key I found in the lock. He stopped laughing as abruptly as he had begun, recognizing in an instant that I meant business. I heard a distant sound from outside, the sound of someone digging, with the confidence of a poker player who has just discovered an ace in the pack. The smile returned to his face. "Aminike!" he screamed. The digging sound stopped. I heard the creak of an external door open, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Another door opened, a door located at the far end of the room. It swung back and a mountain of a man carrying a shovel covered in dirt entered the room. Standing close to 7 foot, the man was naked from the waist up. Drenched in sweat and streamlined with rock-hard muscle, he reminded me of Oddjob from Goldfinger, only 10 times bigger. He bounced the shovel against the wall and plodded over to where I stood. Juku, with the cavalier attitude of a lawyer in an open and shut case, climbed off the couch, waltzed over to me, and with another twisted smile said, "Enjoy." He turned to Emenike, gave him a nod, and disappeared down the darkened corridor which led out of the room. I reverted my attention to the man he had called Emenike, who now stood before me. Superficially speaking, he was the quintessential picture of bone-chilling intimidation. But for a man of my ability and experience, merely an unsophisticated, overdeveloped thug who was likely to be slow, clunky, and predictable. We stared at each other in silence as I prepared to unveil my first move. It was called the right-hand lead, a punch that Muhammad Ali had used to great effect during his world title fight victory over George Foreman in the historic fight known as the Rumble in the Jungle. A single, supposedly arrogant way of firing a punch with little or no regard for your opponent's ability to hit you in a counter-reaction. A punch that was delivered with the intent of demonstrating the significant gulf in speed between yourself and a flat-footed, tortoise-paced adversary. And then it hit me, literally, a right-hand lead, only not one delivered by myself, but by the man standing before me with cat-like reflexes. His fist smashed into my face with the force of a sledgehammer, snapped back my head like a rag doll, and sent me stumbling across the room like an afternoon drunk. Momentarily stunned, momentarily horrified, and frankly speaking, pretty pissed off, I reached up to my face. I could feel the blood seeping through my fingers, a ton of blood spurting from the scar previously left by Bogart's beer mug. A scar that Emenike's giant rock-solid fist had brutally reopened, which sent an unequivocally clear message. This was no wife-beater impersonating a fictional Hollywood tough man, but an elite pugilist who didn't know what it meant to lose. I looked up at the beast of a man who was making a speedy advance for a follow-up offensive. It was going to be a long evening. Chapter 29. Michael, natural-born savior. I was only 13 years old when Jonah last came to my rescue. One late afternoon in autumn, heading home from school, I turned the corner and came across 3 older teenagers hovering outside a local convenience store. Aged between 16 and 18, they were guzzling cans of beer and smoking what my inexperienced mind told me was cigarettes, but in retrospect must have been cannabis. Moments after I'd gone past the trio, a shout echoed in my direction, "Oi!" Without turning, I shot off in a panic, tearing towards a block of flats 500 yards ahead. I heard a bunch of feet pounding the pavement in pursuit, pounding feet which closed in on me like a raging bushfire. Another deafening scream split the air. "Get the fuck over here, you cunt!" The stampede ceased, and another sound sent a sudden chill coursing through my veins. A sound similar to that of a cricket bat slamming into a slab of meat. This was followed by a squeal, a piercing squeal, which brought me to a hard stop and caused me to pivot round. A few feet from where I stood, the thugs were exchanging punches with another boy who had just arrived on the scene, throwing punches and being battered in return by a 12-year-old who was equal to them in size, but at least 5 years younger, a preteen hammering 3 grown teenagers to the ground with near enough every punch he threw. I strolled towards Jonah as he conducted a systematic beating of the 3 boys who had been determined to render me significant harm. There were tears of pain and embarrassment in their eyes now. Astonished by the movement and rock-hard power of Jonah bobbing and weaving like Muhammad Ali in his prime while delivering punches Mike Tyson once described as being loaded with evil intentions. Finally, after each of them had hit the pavement 3 times in a row, their faces beginning to swell from the pummeling, the boys took off running, yelling abuse at both Jonah and me. At the time, I remembered having mixed emotions about the incident. Relief that for the umpteenth time, Joan had saved the day, along with undeniable feelings of jealousy and envy. Jealousy that my brother had a talent I would never possess, and envy that he could somehow do what he did without even trying. So I sat in Juku's basement with the violent commotion echoing from upstairs. My instincts told me Joan had come to the rescue once again. My head continued to pound from the searing pain pulsating through all 4 corners of my mouth. And I felt something I'd never experienced before. A feeling of deep appreciation. Appreciation for who Jonah truly was, which, contrary to the words of an over-enthusiastic PE teacher, was more than just a naturally gifted pugilist. He was a natural-born saviour, a unique individual who was born to do what he did, and a man who would never walk away until he'd been given the last word. Chapter 30. Jonah. Closing arguments. Having had first blood drawn by Emenike, I tucked my face behind a tight guard and darted to my left, using foot speed to reposition myself to deliver a counter-attack. But the giant's reflexes were blinding. In a flash, he was upon me once again, launching a crippling, 2-fisted, non-stop assault. His punches came from all angles and connected to both head and body, each blow feeling like I'd been hit by a high-powered taser, Tyson-esque, to reference a term often used to describe the concussive front foot forward style of boxing's historic destroyer. A Tyson-esque assault, which rendered every strategy I employed to create some distance between us virtually ineffective. To further compound my crisis, my line of sight was now blurred and revealed 2 people rather than just the one before me. A sudden case of double vision, a classic indicator that the first shot had left me with a fractured eye socket. Still on the back foot, a vicious right hook to the temple rocked my equilibrium and momentarily turned my legs to jelly. Fighting on instinct, I maintained my retreat, determined to create the space required to return fire. But I was facing a master in timing and a genius in spacing, making it near impossible to be effective as he stayed in the pocket, refusing to concede an inch. A living, breathing Pac-Man. A naturally gifted pugilist, I'd once been called. A naturally gifted pugilist who was currently on the wrong end of a royal arse kicking. Then, as another punch split my lower lip, and Emenike paused to appreciate his artistry, a wave of bitter defiance swept over me. Defiance because, be it unadulterated confidence, blatant arrogance, or plain old hubris, at 6'5" and 250 pounds, I was yet to be convinced that there was a man alive I couldn't beat in a fist fight. Armed with this solid conviction, I feinted with the left, weaved to the right, and released an earth-shattering punch which crashed into his jaw and sent his head swiveling. A spray of blood and a couple of teeth flew from his mouth. It was a momentous punch, one of the best I'd ever thrown. It was also the one shot I was banking on to reverse the tide. But like a zombie in a low-budget horror flick, Emenike's head just snapped back around. Staring directly at me, his face split into a menacing smile, revealing a toothless gap. an unhinged smile that also told me something else. Something I hated to believe but instinctively knew was real. The punch I'd connected with was a gift, a free shot, which he had permitted, so as to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of what I had in my arsenal. Another way of saying there was no way I could win, and no way I was walking out of there alive. Undeterred, I attempted to fire another right hand, but before I was able to release a clenched fist, I was under siege once again, this time a blitz of an attack that seemed to have doubled in its menace. Smashing his right fist into the side of my head with the momentum of a baseball bat, the giant sunk a murderous body shot into my kidney. Twisting the same punch into a vicious uppercut, he snapped back my head with a blow that scrambled my senses and sent me staggering. He paused to appreciate his work, convinced he was on a home stretch. But to quote Bogey from Casablanca, he was misinformed. Rising swiftly to the occasion, I took a single bound towards him, leapt into the air, and delivered a jaw-shattering uppercut of my own, driving all of my 250 pounds into a single punch. It tore back his head with the visceral brutality of a decapitation and sent him reeling across the room. Having finally turned the tables, I closed the gap and repeated the shot, same mode of application. Another spray of blood, spittle, and several more teeth dislodged from Emenike's mouth. I swept him for the kill, only to have the trajectory of the fight disrupted once again. Skillfully leaning away from another uppercut in the making, the giant dipped down, grabbed me from beneath the waist with both arms, and picked me off the floor. Like a man possessed, he launched himself into the air. For a split second, time stood still. Then we plummeted back down to earth and crashed into the pricey-looking coffee table. It exploded, shattered glass, the cash and cocaine spraying into the air like a ton of talcum-powdered confetti. Instinctively, I attempted to stand up, but with a single crushing headbutt, Emenike sent me crashing back down to the floor. He paused for a moment, took a couple of deep breaths, and threw another punch, a single blow, which had the appearance of what I had expected from the start. A slow punch. Slow, cumbersome, and predictable. Spotting the shot from a mile off, I whipped my head to one side, causing his fist to smash into a large piece of the already shattered coffee table. As the punch connected, he roared like a wounded lion and withdrew his hand, a lengthy shard of glass trapped beneath his skin. Gritting his teeth in agony, he slowly extracted the glass, giving me the opportunity to bring the most visceral of arguments to a definitive close. Springing upright once more, I grabbed his face with both hands and snapped his head to a 90-degree angle. Then I slammed his neck onto a jagged piece of glass. He screamed and sprung to his feet, his hand searching desperately for the entry wound, which, like a broken faucet, was already hemorrhaging blood, bright and pink-red, evidence that I'd hit my intended target, the carotid artery. He yelled, "Chineke," a term I would later discover meant God in the language of the nation's Igbo tribe. He staggered and continued to scream like a man trapped in a gas chamber, screams of terror which told me he knew, as well as I did, that he had at best 4 minutes before he bled out. 4 minutes left of a wasted existence that could have been better spent doing anything other than dying for a cause of which he had no business being a part. But the end came even quicker. 2 minutes later, the giant stumbled to where I was standing. Pale as a ghost, he spoke for the first time. "Who are you?" "Jonah," I said, and smashed my fist into his face, sending him crashing to the floor. Turning away from the expired body, I followed the darkened corridor Juku had retreated down 20 minutes earlier. The hallway was several feet long, a lit room with a closed door facing me at the very end. Trusting my instincts, I proceeded with caution, mindful of what was potentially lurking in the shadows ahead. Seconds later, from a hidden corner to my left, Juku lunged at me with a kitchen knife. He was quick, but not quick enough. Grabbing the wrist of his right hand, I snapped the bone in an instant. He dropped the knife and released an agonizing scream, but there was more to come. Spinning Juku round, I locked him into a rear chokehold with his neck fixed into the crook of my right arm. I used my left hand to apply the pressure to the back of his head. "I'll ask you again," he gasped for air. "Where's Michael?" His left hand slipped into the pocket of his trousers and withdrew what looked like an asthma inhaler. An opportunity for respite which I had no intention of granting him. He raised the pump to his mouth, but with a cruel twist, I broke the wrist of this hand as well. Another blood-curdling scream filled the air. "Where is he?" I demanded again. Surrendering to the pain, he opened his mouth to say something, but that was as far as he got. Taking a backward step to adjust my balance, the floor seemed to disappear from beneath me, a feeling similar to that of stepping off a cliff. We toppled over backwards. With my arm still locked around Juku's neck, he released another terrifying scream. The fall seemed to go on forever. Then we landed. The back of my head struck what felt like a row of concrete steps, and we flew into a 360-degree somersault. Coming full circle, I took the brunt of the concrete steps to the back of my head once more. Like a spinning windmill, a couple of more somersaults followed. As my head hit the stairs for the umpteenth time, I heard the loud sound of a bone shattering. The lights shut out. I lay unconscious for what turned out to be several minutes, stirred awake and stared up at the row of steps we had stumbled down just a few minutes earlier. It was a concrete stairwell, like the descent to some kind of underground bunker, dark and unwelcoming, like the tail end of a rabbit hole. Juku lay on top of me, his neck twisted in an awkward position. It was evident he was dead, and remembering the loud crack I had heard on our way down, I figured a quick death was much too merciful a way for a man of such evil to meet his demise. Shoving his body to one side, like a 126-pound pile of disposable waste, I pulled myself to my feet and turned to a door which stood close to my left, a door to another lit room. Staggering, I yanked the door open and walked inside. Strapped to a chair with his head hung over was Michael. On the floor before him was an open toolbox. Next to the toolbox, a pair of blood-stained pliers and 4 dislodged teeth. Michael raised his head and looked at me. His face split into a weak smile. "What took you so long?" It was a cliche that could have come from 1,000,001 Hollywood action flicks. I consulted my watch. It was 8:15 p.m. I'd given myself 12 hours to locate Michael, and had done it in less than 8. "Go slow," I replied.